what it is, what it was, what it shall be. We're back again. Today's video, Spirit War Boot Camp number 107. Today's video is entitled Extreme Woo Tolerance. How's everyone doing? What is extreme woo? Woo is short for woo-woo, which basically people think of everything dealing with paranormal, everything dealing with far extreme conspiracies and different things that are out of the realm of a day-to-day experience and don't have public scientific verification. This is the general category of woo. So normally I deal with a lot of woo. I mean, this is the Spirit War series, but today we're going to get into extreme woo. So what does that signify? Well, that's the point at which I stop trying to convince people of anything, and I just say some of the more out there shit that I have personally experienced, and how I think people need to kind of expand their sense of normalcy or their normalcy bias, right? To look at the broad span of human history and different types of phenomena that tend to keep coming up all over the world again and again throughout history, okay? And so I hesitate to get into these kind of topics because they've been so clouded with disinfo, misinfo, and just dumb people who don't do real research talking about these topics, okay? So there's this word that I've referred to many times in my videos, and this is the word nephili or nephilim, right? Which I call the cloud people. I have a very different idea about what the nephilim are, but let's just start with that, cloud people, right? Because of course the word nephili in Greek means a cloud, and this is where we get the word nebula or nebulous, things that are misty and cloudy and not super clear and solid, right? Are considered nebulous, right? And so in space, when you have these giant plasma clouds, they're called nebulae. And I'm arguing that there's really, it's not a coincidence that the word nebula, a giant plasmatic gas cloud, and the word nephili or nephilim are directly connected, okay? There is a such thing as discarnate plasma entities, okay? A lot of people talk about ghosts, spirits, demons, astral projection, and things like that, remote viewing. To me, all of these things involve the plasmatic aspect of human consciousness and non-human consciousness, okay? So why do I say that this is a constant fact of human history and mythology since the beginning of time on Earth in all cultures? Because it is, right? But let's just take a super basic examples that aren't shocking to anyone that people know and are familiar with. So let's start out with what's considered the baptism of Jesus Christ from John the Baptist. So what happens at that moment when he's baptized? A cloud descends out of the sky in the form of a dove, right? And it more or less possesses Jesus. And that's the point where he becomes the Christ. He is actually anointed with the Holy Spirit. Okay, so what is a spirit? Well, spirit relates to the word that we have, of course, Spirit War series, right? But the word that we have to inspire, to expire, respiration, right? It's breath. So what is breath? It's a charged plasmatic cloud that keeps us alive, okay? That's why we get energy from the breath, is because it's a charged plasma, okay? And it carries energy in a form of electricity mostly into our lungs and through our hemoglobin, right? It captures this electrical charge and transmits it throughout the body through electromagnetic binding in terms of the ferromagnetic core of the hemoglobin, right? So, of course, without this plasma energy, without a cloud of plasma, if you will, we could not live or have any basic biological functions. So now, let's talk about... So everyone knows about Christ and how Christ became the Christ, and he started doing all these miracles once this Holy Spirit in the form of a dove, which nobody wants to talk about the fact that basically Jesus Christ is possessed by Ishtar, right? The dove goddess, or Columba in the Roman form, the dove goddess, who is the same as Ishtar, the whore of Babylon, and so on, possesses Jesus Christ. It's right there in the Bible. Anyone with ISSC and any degree of cultural literacy about the region beyond whatever, the secret holy, scapegoat tribe, right? Like, if you know anything about anyone else except their version of events, right, you know that this connection is direct. And that's why Jesus encourages people to become eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven, right? So what does that even mean? Of course, Uranos, which is the Greek word for heaven, which appears in the New Testament, is actually a god who was castrated, right? And that's why eunuchs are the core of the Christians in the very beginning. They were the first ones to perform gender-affirming care. So what's the connection between being a castrated eunuch with your cock and balls cut off and Ishtar? Well, that was her. All her priests were castrati, right? That's how, and you cut your cock and balls off and put on a dress. That's the Christian initiation, and that's always how it was back to the earliest days of the church. And this gets into the fact that another fact that nobody wants to discuss, which is the fact that Christianity is no different than Mithraism or the cult of Cybele from ancient Babylon and prior, which is why in all the ancient sources, the Christians were referred to as the Sibylists before they were referred to as Christians. So now, how does this connect to our whole Nephele concept? Well, first of all, as we know, Christ was a castrated eunuch who was possessed by the spirit of this Babylonian and pre-Babylonian goddess. That's why he's the chief cornerstone, right? Because he's going up to the top of the ziggurat, because that's where the static charge builds up, and the Nephele, these cloud plasma entities, want to interface with human beings because of the static charge that's available. Now let's go and talk about some other things that are commonly associated with the Nephilim, which is giant stature. And it scientifically has been proven time and time again that if you subject a young person to a high level of static charge, ozone-rich environment, and high electricity, or if you put them up in, I don't know, let's say the 66th floor penthouse of a giant skyscraper, right? They grow really tall, Baron Trump. Anyway, they grow very tall, and they're gigantes, right? And so there's a connection between this concept of the Nephilim, right, who I would contend it's wrong to think of these as many people do as like these demons. I'm not saying they don't have demonic traits. I'm saying you're misunderstanding if you're looking at these as some type of non-human entities. That's not necessarily the case. And so when the book of Genesis chapter 6 is talking about how the so-called Beni Elohim, which means the sons of the potencies, the sons of the powers. I don't like to use the word God for Elohim because that's not what it fucking means. It has to do with power, the ability, the power, the potency, right? And that's why another phrase that's often used in the Hebrew is Malachim, which means messengers of the gods. So where does God live? He lives in the sky. Who would be a messenger? Oh, I don't know, a plasma entity that comes down to the surface of the earth, right? Right? So these so-called fallen ones, the Nephele, come down to earth and they breed with human women. Now, that doesn't necessarily involve physical intercourse. Maybe it does. I don't necessarily believe that it does. And I'm going to go on to explain why in great detail. But let's just say, you take a woman up to the top of a ziggurat or a pyramid, right, where there's a high amount of static charge, and she becomes more or less permeable to these plasma entities, right, for what we would consider possession. And possession in this context is, again, it's a transcultural phenomenon all around the world. In the ancient Norse, they have what's called the vulva, which is a witch, basically, who goes into an ecstatic trance and becomes possessed by different entities to obtain knowledge of dead people, knowledge of the past, knowledge of the future, knowledge of fate and destiny. Okay, no different than the Sibylline oracles of the ancient Romans and Greeks, right? The oracle at Delphi and the Sibylline oracle. What do? They go down into a plasma vent down below the earth, and they breathe charged ionized sulfur gas and vapors of the laurel tree, for instance. That's why you see the laurel leaf on the sigil of Rome, because Rome entirely revolved around the prophetic pronouncements of these Cumaean and Sibylline oracles. They used it to run their government, and this all goes all the way back to ancient Babylon. They were doing the same thing. So, we think that Christianity is somehow distinct from that, but it's not whatsoever distinct from it. They use the same vocabulary, they use the same terminology. The whole thing is all spelled out in their stories. And so what happens when this plasma entity interfaces with the human being? Well, they can grow really powerful and tall and become giants and men of renown and have exceptional abilities of various types, not limited to intelligence, right? Physical prowess, basically, for all intents and purposes, immortality or extreme longevity. And so let's go forward a little bit in time Let's assume that all the above is somewhat factual and accurate. Now let's go forward in time to the 1500s. And we have a gentleman by the name of John Dee, Johannes Dee, arguably the smartest human being on the planet at the time when he was alive. He had the massive library of 5,000 books back in the time when books were all handmade and could only be held by the aristocracy. And he had not only English books, German books, he had a vast collection of syllabaries and Hebrew lexicons and dictionaries to reconstruct the Hebrew language. And without him, the so-called King James Bible would have never existed. He had the entire library and trained, himself and his disciples in the Kabbalah, right, which is the hermeneutic analysis of the Hebrew alphabet and understanding the numerical codes. John Dee, of course, being a famous geometer, and he published early English translation of Euclid's Elements, which is considered one of the most foundational texts in mathematics on the history of Earth. So he wasn't some weirdo new age retard on drugs. He was a highly educated polymath, not only a mathematician, he was an engraver, a cartographer, and basically spy for Queen Elizabeth I, and multilingual, traveled all over Europe, collecting books and knowledge and spying on different shit and coming up with cryptographic ciphers and so on. So this isn't just some weirdo doing drugs and thinks he's talking to God, okay? He considers himself, well, the world today still considers him the forerunner of modern scientific method through his main student, Francis Bacon. And so arguably the works of Shakespeare and the King James Bible would not have been possible without this person's scholarship, right? So he didn't have the modern, discrepancy that we have between the spiritual and the academic or intellectual, the scientific. They were one thing in his world. And so what did he do? Well, he did this long process using a medium and a scryer, again coming back to this concept, possession by these angelic entities, which according to him conferred upon him something called the Enochian language, which was the language of the angels pre-Tower of Babylon. It was not only the unified speech of Earth at that point, but also the speech and the syntactic code that created all reality. And so what does he do? He creates this elaborate system of geometric ciphers, so-called the watchtowers, and these different tablets, which are cryptographic ciphers, mathematical and geometrical ciphers, used for communicating and decrypting messages from these angelic entities, which he described as squeezing him and his medium, Edward Kelly. So in other words, they could feel the energetic compression from these plasma entities, and by doing so, we're given all this type of material. And with that type of operation, meanwhile, John Dee is, creating the phrase British Empire. He's mapping out all the Atlantic Ocean and most of the eastern seaboard at the time, all the rivers, the Chesapeake Bay in particular. Arguably, some people say that the so-called tower in Connecticut, I forget the name of, something with an F. Anyway, there's this really ancient tower there that's pre-colonial era, which was used as an observatory and is aligned to the solstices, and basically is a, pretty awesome type of observatory slash camera obscura, which was used for studying optical sciences. Newport Tower, there you go. That's the name I was trying to think of. The Newport Tower arguably was built and constructed, and it's in the same type of design appears in John Dee's engravings. And so this dude, how did he do all that? How did they colonize the Americas? Well, he used and talked to angels through a geometric cipher based on the Hebrew alphabet, and created the modern English alphabet with 26 letters based on his cryptographic system, which I've always argued is based upon the geometry of the cube, due to the fact that a cube has 8 vertices, 6 sides, and 12 edges, which adds up to 26, the same number of letters in the English alphabet. And so it's a double 13 cipher based on the lunar cycles and the geometry of the cube. So there's some woo-woo shit for you. And I understand that people may not believe that, but let's look at the fact that in the Kabbalah to this day, a very elementary level of teachings in the Kabbalah will tell you about the Yetziratic ceiling right and the cube of space, which has given you what you call sexagesimal, like base 6 geometry dealing with the cube to navigate space. and to map the surface of the earth for the purposes of cartography, but also astral travel, astral projection, and so on. So now, as we know, as many people know, rather, John Dee was considered to be the first Grand Master of the Rosicrucian Order, which later gave rise to what we call Freemasonry, without which, again, the colonization of the United States and its governmental structure would not have been possible. And so what did these Freemasons do? Well, they basically deal with these angels, and they deal with building architecture. In my opinion, their architecture is designed with piezoelectric and geotelluric effects to concentrate energy to facilitate possession or communication with these plasma entities. Hello. And they pretty much more or less tell you that themselves. If you look really deeply into their teachings, they're all about the so-called nephilim and the pre-flood civilization of Adam and Noah and Enoch. They have degrees named after Enoch, who's, Enochian alphabet, who later becomes Metatron, king of all the angels, right? Right by the throne of the high almighty Yahweh or whatever. So this is not just some kind of haphazard thing. It's not just a mythic story that someone gets taught in Sunday school. Okay, this is a deep mathematical, geometrical, cryptographic cipher that goes back a long time. And has served as the basis for these occult orders such as the Freemasons, the Order of the Cubic Stone, the Golden Dawn, the Martinist Order, the Memphis Mizraim, and blah, 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 blah. A million different groups all claim their heritage back to this John Dee and his Enochian ciphers, dealing with communication and potential spirit possession by these discarnate entities of plasma. Okay, and he didn't create that, and the so-called patriarchs of the Hebrews did not create that either. It goes back to Babylon and Egypt, where they built basically, right angle piezoelectric accumulator for, plasma entities. Creates a giant plasma vortex, and it's like a beacon or like a open 24-hour sign to get involved. And so what else is involved with the pyramid? Well, a perfect cubic resonating chamber built out of rose granite that's perfectly acousto-optic resonating chamber, which if you're trying to trap a plasma entity or get it to kick it for a long duration of time in a stable solitonic format, that's a pretty good structure to accomplish that. As I would argue, are most of the high-level Masonic buildings around the world. The Grand Lodge of England on Great Queen Street after the Whore of Babylon, right? This isn't just haphazard stuff. Or the House of the Temple, 13 blocks north of the White House, which is again a ziggurat based on the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, which is largely reputed to be the resonant chamber that stores the discarnate ghost of Albert Pike, and is pretty haunted by many accounts. And so what if there's a science beyond all that? There's a perfectly workable, scientific, replicatable methodology and a methodological science behind all that. And if that's the case, and we know that there are these very powerful groups throughout our government that are older than the United States, older than arguably Britain itself, older than whatever, why don't we know anything about it? Why did it take me 30 years of studying all these different secret societies and stuff like that, to discover this information? Why has no one ever taught the electromagnetic basis of human health and cognition, longevity, and so on? Because we're on the slave tier, we're not one of the privileged Illuminati vessels to be possessed by these discarnate spirits of the Nephilim and stuff like, or these planetary archangels and so on like that. Not that you can't, you could do that. But there's an incredible amount of hygiene and discipline that's required to engage in that in any kind of stable way. But what do we have instead of that? Well, we have stuff like, L. Ron Hubbard, creator of Scientology, talking about body thetans and how there's these discarnate entities that can basically parasitize humans and cause all kinds of mental dysfunction. And he also teaches his acolytes and his disciples, like that dude that was in the Project Stargate. Most of the early Project Stargate remote viewers were former Scientologists, for instance. Interesting fact. So they clearly knew something, because they were telling how you want to become an operating thetan, which is a discarnate entity. And again, theta pertaining not coincidentally to the theta brainwave state, which is heavily utilized for this so-called remote viewing, which is where you basically project your consciousness and your senses throughout space and time and observe distant locations and spy on it, basically, just like John Dee used a similar type of faculty to come up with his cartographic mapping of the entire, eastern seaboard of the United States, as well as the Atlantic Ocean and all the islands around it. One good way to engage in that. And of course, John Dee, like I said, being 007, the original 007, that's how he signed his letters to Queen Elizabeth, because he was a secret agent, right? So what does that represent? It's an eye with the Shabbatian 7, right? Which represents the 7 Partsufim in the Kabbalah, which is the 7 portals or gateways within the human body, closely connected to the idea of chakras. But it's also equated with these afflictive emotions such as fear, hatred, jealousy, anger, lust, the seven deadly sins and stuff like the gluttony and all that, right? So in the Kabbalistic system, they openly describe the fact that there's these serpentine archontic parasites that possess the human body. And Martinists have quite an, which is a Masonic order called Order of St. Martin, or different names, basically the Martinists, or the Elu Cohens, that's something they're also called. So anyway, they pretty much detail this all in quite a bit of detail. They explain it all quite thoroughly, and that through engaging in the initiatory rites of this order, you're supposed to be purifying your body of these 7 types of archontic parasites that can possess the human, modify our behavior, cause various types of dysfunction and delusional states and hallucinations, and more or less control the human. Just like a parasite, like a physical parasite, like worms and different things that get in the body, helminths and all these different flatworms and tapeworms and all these different things that live inside the human body and modify our behavior. So now it's interesting because, we have a history from the founding of America up to now, where the U.S. government has been studying all these things that I'm telling you and practicing them in secret and using it as a basis for these initiatory orders, and engaging in all kinds of ritualistic behaviors, such as the presidential inauguration, which is where this entity drills itself, comes down from the 13 blocks up north of the White House, comes down into the giant pentagram that terminates at the White House and installs itself into the president. So people can do what they want with that information. I'm telling you though, if you were to go look into that, there's quite a bit of documentation. You could spend your entire life just learning all the ins and outs of what I'm telling you, but yet no one talks about it, no one knows it. And now we have the situation where our government's trying to come out and be like, oh yeah, we got non-human intelligence, and we got, extraterrestrial biologics and all these different things, which is they're just telling you about their cloning program, because based on this ideology that they have of instilling different types of non-corporeal entities into human being and try to genetically CRISPR and breed forever, the Jesuits and the Bene Gesserits, and they're trying to breed the so-called royals and nobility classes to produce perfectly possessible hosts for these entities, and initiating them into all these secret societies in order to gradually acclimate it through successive approximation and get them more and more acclimatized to hosting these types of different entities. And the same's true of the entertainment industry, and lots of musicians and lots of these high profile people are involved with the same type of stuff. But my point is to say, I'm trying to get all this information out there and cut through the woo, and understand that when you're looking at these historical texts like the Bible, this isn't written for you, okay? It's not written to give you an education. It's written as a cryptographic cipher for these elite societies that don't tell you the decryption methods. They're not telling you the Tamura and the Notarikon and all their gematria and all the number codes and different levels of encryption. They call it the Peshat and the Panemius and all these different levels of encryption that are in all the scriptures, and you don't even know the top level of the interpretation. And there's at least 4 other ones below that that you don't have because you haven't been initiated, and you're not an Elus Cohen of the elect, chosen people of the Nephilim hybrids. So, but my point is, you're in a precarious situation where the government's openly coming out and talking about in the open stuff that they've been keeping secrets for hundreds of years. And I think there's a high probability that they wouldn't be doing that unless there's an agenda. There's a certain desired outcome that they want from that, and they're not telling you about it. But I would just throw in some other stuff dealing with, Project Stargate, which Donald Trump signed $500 billion investment into all these data centers and things. Right at the same time that humanity's recovering from a global nanotech vaccination campaign and, aerial nanoparticles, aerosol injections into the upper atmosphere, smart dust, and neural lace of Elon Musk and Neuralink and Starlink. And, it's a technological form of possession. And so if you don't even have a concept that your body is an electrostatic receptor and transceiver, right? You're not taking steps to basically develop your facility with these electrostatic currents and how to use them for your benefit. And you're not defending yourself against the pernicious influence that's being deployed against you on the same type of domain. Better learn or else, it won't be long before your consciousness is not your own. And it doesn't require even some kind of powerful Nephilim demons or anything like that. It requires Starlink and 5G Wi-Fi and a $30 smartphone like the one I'm holding. So, these are things that's very relevant to people to learn. And I don't think people really are learning that very well. And I think there's a lot of disinformation and muddying the waters. And I think even without all that, it's pretty difficult to understand all the ins and outs of this. And it's highly complex, but it is possible. And for whoever is interested in that, I have a lot of information to share. So see you next time.